if you swapped in Robert Mueller for George Stephanopoulos, the Mueller investigation may have ended very differently. Donald Trump trashing his former White House counsel Don McGahn in that interview with ABC News, claiming that McGahn lied under oath when he told Mueller's investigators that the president wanted him to fire the special counsel.
He lays out a lot of evidence, including the episode where you ask your White House counsel, Don McGahn, you tell him Mueller has to go. You call him twice and say, Mueller has to go. Call me when it's done.
I was never going to fire Mueller. I never suggested firing Mueller.
That's not what he says.
Excuse, I don't care what he says. It doesn't matter. That was to show everyone what a good counsel he was.
Why would Don McGahn
we had a
lie?
business.
Why would he lie under oath? Why would he lie under oath?
Because he wanted to make himself look like a good lawyer, or he believed it because I would constantly tell anybody that would listen, including you, including the media, that Robert Mueller was conflicted. Robert Mueller had a total conflict of interest. I didn't say that.
At this point, the president's lawyer's legal strategy is starting to make a lot more sense. When seated with anyone other than Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham, Donald Trump seems to fall apart. He seems to lack the mental acuity and the truth-telling capacity to field real questions from real journalists. And to be clear, if Donald Trump had made those comments you just saw to Robert Mueller, they would have contradicted the testimony not just of McGahn, but of nearly a half a dozen other witnesses who testified to the president's designs on firing special counsel Mueller. Close Trump allies like his friend Chris Christie, Reince Priebus, and Steve Bannon, and meticulous note-takers like Annie Donaldson, McGahn's former chief of staff. Now, the McGahn smear comes on the third day of sustained outrage in national security circles from Donald Trump's enthusiastic embrace of colluding with foreign governments in the future without calling the FBI.
Your campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, Norway, we have information on your opponent. Oh, I think I'd want to hear it.
Do you want that kind of interference in our elections?
It's not an interference. They have information. I think I'd take it.
God, poor Norway. Donald Trump took his broom and dustpan over to Fox News this morning for a little cleanup. We'll get into that in a minute. But first, the twin clouds that have hung over Donald Trump's presidency since the beginning, questions about colluding with a foreign power, and then questions about obstructing the investigation into the foreign powers election meddling have been thrust back into the news by none other than Donald Trump. And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. At the Washington Post, White House reporter Ashley Parker. With us on set, former chief spokesman for the Department of Justice, Matt Miller, Jonathan Swan, national political reporter for Axios, politics reporter for the Daily Beast, Betsy Woodruff, and Elliot Williams, former deputy assistant attorney general. Matt Miller, I have got to start with you. I watched that and thought, wow, I thought what made Don McGahn a great White House counsel was all those judges and two Supreme Court justices, but maybe Donald Trump thinks he's telling the truth to Robert Mueller. But if there had been an interview with this president and Robert Mueller, I mean, this is why people like Rudy Giuliani said they'd lay their bodies down on the train tracks before they let Donald Trump answer questions from Mueller about the obstruction investigation.
Yeah, the president's legal team wasn't the A team or maybe even the B team or the C team, but even Rudy Giuliani and John Dowd could figure out that if he sat down with the special counsel for an interview, he would do one of two things. Maybe he'd do both of them. He would, number one, admit to a crime, admit to facts that constitute obstruction of justice, or two, he would lie about it and commit a crime of false statements to investigators. Someone said to me the other night that George Stephanopoulos got his Lester Holt moment, and that's kind of true. And the thing that they both had in common, all they did was turn the camera on and let the president talk. These weren't especially hard questions that George Stephanopoulos was asking. And you saw the president just completely kind of have a meltdown on a couple of different fronts, both on the kind of, you said the Russia collusion front, kind of Russia collusion 2020 maybe, and then on the obstruction of justice front. Imagine if he can't take those questions, how he would do against trained interrogators from the special counsel's office.
Well, and I don't know that it's the right frame to say he can't take the questions. I mean, I think it's that the the truth is that he is more than collusion curious. He's collusion enthusiastic. Would not call the FBI. So in the future, I mean, forget about for a second what happened in 2016. In 2020, he's in. I mean, he's into it. Norway, pick up the phone and dial. I'm here for you. And on obstruction, his testimony, if he had simply said what he said to George, would have contradicted that of at least a half a dozen other people quoted in the footnotes in the body of the Mueller report.
Yeah, it would have if he had said it would have been a clear false statement. It would have been a crime. But it shows the trap that he would have been in. Like that, he liked to say, well, it was a trap that the prosecutors were setting for me. He was in a trap by the fact that he obstructed justice. He set the trap for himself. He could not go in and give. I mean, he couldn't go in and give that answer because it would be a lie. But he couldn't go in and admit to what he'd done because that would have been an admission of obstruction of justice. He didn't do an interview for the reason a lot of guilty people don't do interviews, because there's no good. There is no good way out of it. You either go in and admit to a crime or you commit a crime of lying about it.
You've got a great tweet up and some new reporting from a source close to McGahn. You write this, and your source close to McGahn says, quote, anyone who believes Trump wasn't telling Don to get rid of Mueller using these conflicts is just stupid or believes in the tooth fairy.
Yeah, that was in response to having watched what President Trump said about Don McGahn. I got this from this source about an hour ago. They also said that really nothing the president said, if you actually listen very carefully to him, he sort of doesn't really contradict Don McGahn. Don McGahn didn't say that President Trump said go and fire Mueller. He said talk to Rod Rosenstein and tell him that these conflicts are just too bad and he has to go. Now, President Trump denied saying has to go, but you can see the way, he keeps talking. He'll sort of say half a sentence and then he'll start going on about Mueller's conflicts. He's not even fully kind of denying those conversations with McGahn. It's so pretty messy.
Let me just read what the Mueller report writes about this incident. So McGahn decided, this is from the Mueller report, about what has been thrust back into the public view, not by the media, but by Donald Trump. From the Mueller report, quote, McGahn decided he had to resign. He called his personal lawyer, that's Bill Burke, we know, and then he called his chief of staff, Annie Donaldson, to inform her of his decision. He then drove to the office to pack his belongings and submit his resignation letter. Donaldson recalled that McGahn told her the president had called and demanded he contact the Department of Justice and that the president wanted him to do something that McGahn did not want to do. That evening, McGahn called both Priebus and Bannon and told them he intended to resign. Priebus recalled that McGahn said the president had asked him to do crazy bleep, rhymes with hit. Whenever I say rhymes with, I always end up saying the bad word. I caught myself in the nick of time. But he thought McGahn did not tell him the specifics of the president's request because McGahn was trying to protect Priebus for what he did not know. Now, so consistent with what Jonathan's saying, but I think the head to fire Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Certainly what was investigated as an obstructive act was the attempts to fire Special Counsel Mueller.
Yes, and this really was one of the more interesting and exciting portions. It got me back to being a prosecutor, because one of the things they start off the section with is saying, we think Don McGahn is a credible witness. We don't believe, after investigating, interviewing him and talking to him, that he had an incentive to lie. A number of other things, too. His statements are corroborated. If you look, like you said, at the footnotes, Annie Donaldson, Chris Christie, and Reince Priebus all sort of build this narrative that suggests that Don McGahn is telling the truth. And we have no reason to believe that he's not telling the truth.
Let me just add to McGahn's credibility. McGahn is complying with the White House edict that he not testify before Congress, risking criminal contempt of Congress if Congress decides to head in that direction.
And the other thing that seemed fishy to McGahn and Mueller points out, what was the urgency? If you notice, it's between the 14th and the 17th of the month that this all goes down, and the president really wants this all to happen on a Saturday morning, and he's just really so the idea that Don McGahn fabricated this or is confused is just foolish. And every time, just like Matt said, every time the president opens his mouth, he steps in it even further on this.
And we should also put out that Don McGahn continues to this day to be loyal to Donald Trump. The only two humans on the planet who've called Don McGahn a liar are Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani, and not even Rudy Giuliani on all 7 days of the week, seemingly just on even ones.
What's important is that everyone except for President Trump that we know of, who has direct knowledge of the conversations that McGahn had with the president, concurs unanimously that what McGahn says matches reality. There's not a single credible witness who disputes thus far any of the claims that McGahn has made, except, of course, Trump himself, who, as Jonathan pointed out, kind of is a little bit iffy in the way that he verbalizes this. It's odd. It's his odd way of talking about these complex legal matters. And taking a step back, one of the things that's really interesting is the fact that President Trump's legal team sort of shifted the way it talked about Mueller when Rudy Giuliani came in. For about the last year of the Mueller investigation, there was this very aggressive, sort of hyperactive response to the Mueller probe that showed a marked change from the first year.
To smear him. I mean, it changed. Ty Cobb and John Dowd were working with him. They cajoled the president into cooperating, letting everybody cooperate. That was the legal framework under which Don McGahn spent at least 30 hours with Robert Mueller's investigators. And to Rudy Giuliani, and more importantly, and probably less splashy, was Emmett Flood, who came in and really halted a lot of access for Mueller. So it was a significant change in their posture. But I don't want to say the damage had been done. The truth had been told. They already had all this information. And I think it's remarkable, as you said, that all you see is George Stephanopoulos asking questions that, you know, I'm not trying to take away from George's performance. It's masterful. But simply asking what's now been public for months, what's in the Mueller report, and Trump falls apart, sort of falls between these cracks of what's been testified to and corroborated by half a dozen people.
Emmett Flood's role is really interesting. When he was first put in place as taking Ty Cobb's old job, a person close to him told me that Emmett Flood taking that role meant Donald Trump would never have a verbal conversation with Mueller, and that bore out.
Ashley Parker, I want to show you the president's reaction to this line of questioning. Calls George a wise guy.
If you answer these questions to me now, why not answer them to Robert Mueller under oath?
Because they were looking to get us for lies, for slight misstatements. I looked at what happened to people, and it was very unfair.
You didn't answer questions on obstruction.
No, wait a minute. I did answer questions. I answered them in writing.
Not on
I don't know about
obstruction.
those. I don't know. I answered a lot of questions. They gave me questions. I answered them in writing.
Not an obstruction.
Look, George, you're being a little wise guy, okay? Which is, you know, typical for you. Just so you understand. Very simple. It's very simple. There was no crime. There was no collusion.
And NBC's Peter Alexander, our White House correspondent, is adding this reporting to our understanding of this now war of words today between Don McGahn and Donald Trump. Peter's reporting that a person close to former White House counsel Don McGahn is dismissing President Trump's comments to ABC News, where he disputes McGahn's testimony, saying, quote, "It's just Fantasyland." So we've got Fantasyland, we've got the Tooth Fairy. I mean, McGahn pushing back more than he did the first couple rounds of smears against McGahn. Do you think McGahn is someone who might eventually get battered enough to testify?
I don't understand the sense in publicly attacking Don McGahn. I can't fathom it. I mean, I really can't fathom it.
Explain that, because he is the person.
Are you goading him into? I mean, I know this is just what the president does, and I don't think he's thinking about it in a strategic fashion.
Because who should expect a president to think strategically?
I don't believe that he is thinking strategically, but what is he? I mean, is he just trying to goad Don McGahn into making a public statement? I mean, it's kind of, and now we're seeing, I mean, again, I wonder if it's the same source, but sources close to McGahn, we're seeing these very similar statements. I don't know. I mean, I don't think that this changes the calculus, at least in the short term, about whether he testifies or not, but I just don't see the sense in it.
Ashley Parker.
Again, I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. The president is getting dangerously close to almost pushing for an outcome that he doesn't want in one benefit him. So, right, you have Don McGahn, who is someone who, based on the Mueller report and based on everything we understand, repeatedly actually saved the president from himself. The president may not have liked it in those moments, and in fact, he didn't. At the time, we heard a lot about clashes with Don McGahn, and he didn't like Don McGahn because Don McGahn would stand up to him and give him the lawyer's point of view. And it turns out, in hindsight, the president's very lucky that Don McGahn was there playing that role. Don McGahn only testified for those 30 hours you mentioned because he was abiding by, and you can disagree with if it's good or bad strategy, but he was abiding by a strategy cooked up by the president's lawyers at the time, and he is now risking possible contempt to defy a congressional subpoena. So he is not the person, he's not like these Democrats. He's not the person you want to goad into finally kind of saying, I've had enough. That's not a savvy strategy.
He's also one of these sort of figures in Trump land with ultimate credibility. He's not a liberal's fantasy. He's not some whistleblower. He's not turned on the president. He stands behind the Supreme Court picks. His legacy is all of this vast body of judicial appointments. His close ally in the Senate is Mitch McConnell. I mean, he's not going to be this satisfying witness for the left, and he's not, it would appear, anymore going to feel beholden personally to the White House. He is the ultimate truth teller, and if he simply testifies to what is in the Mueller report on television in front of cameras, it would be devastating to this president.
It would be devastating, but I think all the things you just mentioned are the reasons why Don McGahn's not testifying. Look, the president keeps attacking him because over the last 3 or so years, the president has learned one lesson about the Republican establishment. He can push them around, he can attack them, he can beat them up, and they will cave every time. And Don McGahn is nothing if not a member of the Republican establishment. And from everything you hear, he and Trump basically hate each other at this point. But McGahn's entire world is this conservative.
Integrity on the line? Isn't his reputation? And hasn't he already testified in the Mueller report to the truth?
That he's testified to the truth, but the place where he cares about his reputation is with Mitch McConnell, is with the members of the Federalist Society, is with the conservative establishment, the Republican establishment. And none of those people want to see him bring Donald Trump down.
But he would be the rare figure because he has those allies who could sustain telling a few minutes of truth about the garbage that went on in this West Wing.
He might.
He was asked to write a phony letter to the record denying a story that was true.
He might, or he might be an outcast in the Republican Party for the rest of the life. Where is the reward for telling the truth in the Republican Party right now? Look what's happened to Justin Amash when he stood up and told the truth. He comes up and gives this hearing. His days as a hero of the Republican Party are probably over.
I want to ask all of you about the wisdom of doing a network interview. I mean, how did this even happen?
Do more. Why would we question the wisdom? Why? What are you doing? Were you sabotaging everyone?
Help me help you. I saw you interview. I hope you're next.
I think there should be more of them, and they're great.
With you, Betsy.
I agree 100%.
Keep talking. He's giving lawyers lots of work, and I think I have a lot of colleagues that I think would enjoy seeing the president talk more, because it's just literally he is getting himself, or I think ought to get himself in trouble every time he opens his mouth because he's further implicated. Like I think we'll talk about the campaign finance stuff a little bit later, but this was a treasure trove that he opened up in the interview yesterday. We're essentially stepping up to future offenses. So keep talking, man. Keep going and talk to the reporters.
Actually, I want to show you, even the cleanup seemed problematic. Let me play this clip from Fox and Friends.
How are you going to, if you don't hear what it is, you're not going to know what it is. I mean, how can you report something?
How do you know it's bad if you don't listen to it?
So, Mr. President,
no, they say, oh, he would accept it. Well, if I don't listen, you're not going to know. Now, if I thought anything was incorrect or badly stated, I'd report it to the Attorney General, the FBI. I'd report it to law enforcement. Absolutely.
Actually, I said yesterday that sound made my hair follicles hurt, and it really does. It's the listening that's criminal. It's not what they say. It's the conduct. I mean, we're 2 years in. The Mueller report was conducted, and it ended, and he still thinks that the contact and the conduct of listening to a foreign power is permissible, is galling, shocking.
Well, not just that, but he seems really to be missing the point. He's basically saying, look, if the opposition isn't devastating enough, if it's really inaccurate, it won't really hurt my opponent, then of course I would turn it over to the FBI. But the point is, as you said, it's not just the listening. It's the listening. It's the receiving of it. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad APA. What matters is there is a foreign entity actively trying to interfere in a U.S. presidential election, period, end sentence.
Ashley Parker, what's your sense of how the White House feels about the wisdom of the ABC interview?
So 2 points on that. One thing that I think Betsy and Jonathan also understand and might find funny is we spend all of this time frantically calling sources to try to find out what the president is secretly and privately saying and thinking. And sometimes you just turn a camera on and he just says it publicly. And I will say there was a sense within the White House, even before sort of the full extent of his comments were made public, that they knew that what he said was problematic. They knew that there was going to be some cleanup involved. And you saw that. You saw Hogan Gidley coming out. You saw people from the campaign coming out, and they're in a tough position because they can't actually say the president said something deeply problematic and that was a mistake. So they're just sort of saying that thing you thought you heard him say, he didn't actually say.
So we're back to don't believe what you see, don't believe what you hear, and maybe we should get used to a whole lot more of that.
Sort of. Or as the president said himself, it's not what I said, it's what I meant.
All right, buckle up, right?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.